Greetings! In this video we will UV map our basic poly spaceship. We'll open the UV editor, which is this icon here on the poly shelf. And if you were working in another shelf, you could come up in the modeling mode to UV editor. And this is what we'll be producing. We have taken this three-dimensional object and we've laid it out flat. This will allow us to create a texture, either using Paint Effects in Maya or a third-party application like Photoshop. We'll be limiting ourselves to just 4 tools. We will use the cut edge, and then the sew and stitch, which do the same thing. There's a subtle difference, and I'll explain that in a moment, but we'll be cutting, we'll be stitching and sewing. We'll be using the unfold tool, and then up at the bottom of the long set of transforms, there is flip, UNV. So cut, stitch and sew, unfold, and flip are all the tools that we need to be able to produce this UV map, which is at its core a three-dimensional object laid out flat. We have the top here and the bottom. So let's get started. We want to delete all our history, just make it easier, delete all history. And if you look in your outliner, if there are additional nodes, you can just select those and delete them. There may be some transform nodes left over from your modeling, but you can see here I just have a single node, a poly mesh continuous surface, and we're going to work just on 1/2. We will UV map 1/2, and then we'll mirror the geometry back over, and those UVs will follow. So I'm drawing a bounding box around the faces of 1/2. I'm in the orthographic top view, and we'll just delete those. And you want to zoom in and check, and I can see that I missed this one, right? So you might miss some small faces. And then also important, you don't want to have selected over that center line and inadvertently deleted some small faces on this side. So we have just 1/2, and we'll get started with the UV. So I opened this file and I already have a UV produced, but this is what you'll be jumping into. We'll come to UV planar, and we're just going to give ourselves a right angle projection on the Y. And so here's my planar mapping options. Let me in fact reset this. So I'm going to choose the Y, and then I'm also going to choose keep image width and height. Let me show you what happens if you don't have that selected. So let's say we project that. It will take the entire shape and fit it into our 1-to-1 space. This is our standard UV space. So it stretched it to fit. We probably will be better off if we keep the proportions of our model. So I have keep image width height ratio. Now when we project, you can see that it is following that closely. Now we're going to cut this. The elements, the bottom is simple to see what we will cut and set aside. We'll also select that kind of jet engine that we created from a cylinder. We'll cut the top, and then we'll have the sides remaining. We'll use the UV project a few times for the back and the front, and then we'll stitch that all together. So let's start with this jet engine, the cylinder jet engine. And we're going to select edges. I have that edge select. I'm going to hit the F key just so we can get in there nice and tight and see. And I'll click around. I'm using the Shift key, obviously, to make additional selections. You can hit the 4 key. And I have a closed edge, which means I can now, when I cut it, I can separate this. So we'll come over to our tools, and under cut and sew, we'll hit cut. You see you have a nice thick edge there that indicates the cut, and we will select the shell. So these shapes that we're looking at here in the UV editor are referred to as shells, the UV shell. So I'll pick that, and we can use our same transform tools, and I'm going to set that aside just for a moment. Now our goal is to have everything sitting flat, and that cylinder, right, certainly has overlapping UVs. If we were to try to paint, we'd only be able to paint on the top. We couldn't paint on the sides or the bottom, so we have to lay that out. We'll do that in a moment. Let's now, probably the next simplest thing would be to cut the bottom off. We're not going to do too much with the bottom. And we just want to select, I'm going to hit the Q key to get back to my select tool. And this selection is important. We want to find a contour, and you can go back and forth between 4 and 5. We're tracing, right? We're not leaving any gaps. We know that we already cut that cylinder off. We'll hit that edge, and then we'll come back around. And I have a edge that's going all the way around. Pause for a moment and look at that. Check that. It's a closed edge that's going all the way around it. When I say closed, I mean that there are no gaps. I don't have the center line selected, but just this set here, that will automatically be cut. And you can see there that that follows all the way around. And there's a shared edge. That's why this is highlighted here, that this edge is shared. But we have this edge, and we'll hit cut, and now I can select it. If we're selecting here, we can pick UV shell, but because the top is there, I would get the top. I can also select the UV shells here. So I'll right click UV shell. I can pick that bottom one, and we can, I'll just set it aside here for a moment. Let's put it over here with the cylinder. And right, what we're after is that there's no overlap. So there are no overlapping UVs. When we took this into Photoshop or we're using Paint Effects, we'd be able to paint whatever we wanted to paint on the bottom of that. Now the remainder is a little bit more complicated. We could just cut the top off, and in fact we're going to do that, but then we're going to have to think about how we want to handle the sides. We have this side, right, which is looking down the X. We have this, which is looking down the Z, as well as the back looking down the Z. So we'll create some projections for that in a moment. Let's go ahead, and as we did for the bottom, we'll trace around. And if you want to pause this to make sure you're making the exact right selections, we'll come around, and we've got that loop out. You can hit 4 and 5 to make sure. And what we're after is that there are no gaps. So this edge comes all the way around, edge to edge to edge, and there are no gaps. We can use our cut. We'll hit cut. And now I can just right click here, choose UV shell, and we have this top. And there are no overlapping UVs on this top if we were to look at it here, right? Because that was a clean projection just straight on the Y. And now we're left with these sideways faces. And this is, right, this is what we're trying to accomplish, is to lay these out flat so that we can paint them. They're sitting exactly sideways, so there's no way that I could paint these faces. Let me demonstrate. We'll come to 5, and let's just talk about these 3 faces here. Right? We'd like to be able to paint the side of the spaceship, but you can see that they're sitting sideways. So if we were to paint, there's no way that we would be able to paint on these faces. So we can have them selected, and we'll just go, right, this is on the X. We'll say UV planar. We're going to open that dialog box. We projected on the Y. Now we'll project on the X, and now you can see the shape. Now it turned it the wrong direction. We'll just use our regular old transform tools, and we'll scale that, and we're going to put it, that's about where we're going to stitch it in. And in fact, we can go ahead and stitch now. So we want to pick the shared edges. So these 2 edges are shared. And you can see when I hit stitch, the smaller of the 2 shells will jump to stitch together with the heavier or the larger of the 2 shells. If I use sew, the smaller stays in the same place. So that's essentially the difference. There we go stitching, you see it jumps over, and there we go sewing, and it stays in place. And there are instances when one, especially when we do the back, we'll probably have to use the sew. But we'll do all 3 of these together. we'll hit stitch together, and those jump over there. And now we can see, right, here is the top of our ship. If I grab this face, right, we see that top, but we also now see the side. So I'm looking at both of these faces, the top and the side, they're both laid out flat. And this will allow us to paint and texture. Okay, so we've got that side. Let's tackle the back. Probably the most challenging is this intake here. So let's come back to the back. And if you ever aren't sure what you're selecting, remember you can pick the faces and the highlight. So if I grab that, right, I can see, oh, those are those faces. Or conversely, I could pick the face and see, oh, that's highlighted there. So if you ever get kind of confused, you can pick the face and then visually understand the correspondence. But I'm going to grab these faces. Let's zoom in there so you can see this a little bit better. I'm going to grab these faces. Don't have faces on anything else. And again, these are just sitting sideways. And so we would want to project on the Z. And we had just selected Z, if you remembered that. Oh, excuse me, X. No, we projected on the side. So we're projecting on the Z. We'll hit project, and now you can see that shape, right? And we can put this up here. Now we'll probably have to use flip. We'll pick an edge. I'll pick this edge, and you can see, right, this is the shared edge. But why isn't it here? Why is it over on that side? Well, the UV is flipped. This shell, I should say, is flipped. So we will flip it back. I'll have it selected, and that's what I mentioned in the transform. If we come up to transform and towards the bottom, there is flip. And we'd be flipping on the V in this case, right? Just flipping it upside down. And we'll get it in about proximity. And then, not a bad idea, just to scale that, and it'll do a better job stitching. So we'll come here. And I mentioned sometimes on this portion we'll want to sew. So when we hit stitch, right, that came off the center line, which we'd like to keep that center line. Although there are some things we could do down to fix that. But let's keep this center line here, and let me get this a little bit straighter. And so for the first one, we'll use sew, right? Because sew doesn't move anything. So we'll sew that one, and then we'll stitch. Oh, I double clicked and got all the way around. We'll have to manually select here. Oops, and I missed that one. So we'll hit stitch together, and now those flow properly. Let me review. So here we've got the top. Right, if we were to pick this face, we can see, pick this face. We can see that corresponding here. And this is what we're after, right? We want to be able to paint that back. We want to be able to paint the rear, and we can see those faces here. Now, the proportion is a little bit off, right, because there's the back. And so we may want to, you could come in here and maybe just pull these edges down a little bit with our transform tools. Oh, and I'm sorry, if we have a shared edge, we aren't going to move those edges. We want to transform the UVs. That is, when we have a shared edge, we'd be moving both edges across the shell. So if we're going to be manipulating, we want to manipulate the UVs. Okay, now here's a little piece left over. Let's select it, and I bet that's the nose. And so that got left over, right? Because we projected down, we got the bottom, we got the side, and we left this little piece behind. So we can bring that, we can bring that back and place it. And we want to pick that edge, and we can see this one is upside down, right? These two edges should be both highlighted. That it's highlighted on this side, we have to flip it. So we'll come and pick this. We've got V already, and we'll hit flip. And now when we choose edge, those are together and we can hit stitch together. Now it shifted, so let's use sew. We'll get those nice and close and we'll hit sew, and there we go. And then we can also, just to finish this thought, right, because this is a shared edge that's now open, we'll also hit sew. And now come back to U, V. Now we've got the front of our ship. Okay, so that little face was left over. Let's grab this face. We'll just get a bounding box. That's what we're looking at. It's sitting sideways. And so we will planar project on the Z. And there you can see the piece very well. But this interior space has lots of overlapping. You can pick these UVs. I'm going to deselect the outright, the control key to deselect. And you could try unfold, and that actually did a pretty good job. So the unfold tool does a good job of unfolding UVs when you have overlapping UVs. Let me just show you, if you were doing this manually, you could have also come in here and manually pick these UVs, say these 4 UVs here, right, which are currently overlapping, and we could scale them down. And then if you use Shift more than, that will go up one set of components, Shift more than, and we've manually laid those out. But the unfold did a good job as well. So we can see all of the UVs. There are no overlapping UVs, and that means that we could paint cleanly. And then we can put this back in here. So here's an edge, 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 and the last one out, edge, and we'll hit stitch together. And now that's in there. We've got a little bit of overlap here. So we'll manually just unfold that, make this make a little bit more sense visually, and I think we've got a little overlap. No overlap, but it's just kind of tight. So we'll just relax that, and yeah, that's the corner. So we've got that laid out flat. We can paint the top, we can paint the side, we can paint the front of the wing, the rear of the wing, and the rear of the ship, all having been laid out flat. And then our final technique, and this technique is a little bit different than anything else that we did. We're going to cut a seam, which will allow the unfold algorithm to know where to lay. So let's come, and when we're cutting seams, we want to cut it in the least conspicuous. So having it on the kind of interior, that means that we'll be able to paint kind of the top around to the side to the bottom without having any seams. We'll have one seam here, and when you're painting, you'll have to keep track of that. I'll double click. Again, we've got that on the bottom. It's not a edge loop where we haven't selected the edge all the way around the way that we had to do for the top and the bottom, where we wanted to make sure that there were no gaps. This has gaps, and this will have gaps, but that's okay because we're going to be using the unfold. So I'm going to hit cut. It's not a loop that goes all the way around, so I can't separate it, right? Before, when we did the top and the bottom, we were separating the shells. If I come and pick, you see that it's still a singular shell. But when we hit unfold, it used that edge to create the border. So right, this edge, that's the edge that we had selected, and it's now laid flat. This edge, right, and that edge all the way around. So that is our border. And we'll bring this over, and we can stitch it back in. We'll maybe straighten it out. Proportionately, my UV is a little bit larger. Now, there are issues of stretching and squashing the texture. When you want to have lay down a texture perfectly, you'll want your UVs to correspond exactly to the dimensions of the model. When you're working with organics, you have a little bit more flexibility, but with a hard surface model like this, where maybe we're laying down insignia or something like that, you would want these to match precisely. I'm going to just grab these three and we'll hit stitch together. Now that gave me sideways, but I can come and I've selected the UVs and we'll just straighten that out manually. All right, so there are our two pieces, our top laid out, and let's finish this by mirroring the object. We will be mirroring, right, this is the x-axis. We're currently sitting in positive x, so we're going to mirror into the negative x. We'll say mesh, mirror, dialog box, x negative. We'll hit mirror, and then just to make sure everything welded properly, not too much and not too little, I'm going to just manually type in 0.1 for the merge threshold. And for a model like this, that is probably exactly what we want. Now it doesn't appear as though anything's happened here, but if we pick a shell, we can move that and we see that there are two, and we want to just make sure. So this is the one, if we're looking down, this is on the right hand, and so this is the one that needs to be flipped. And if we come back to flip, we're talking now U flip, so we'll flip that, right? And we can pick this piece, and let's make sure, so this would be looking down, right, this way. So this is needing to be flipped. We'll hit flip. And we can merge these together. So edge, or I should say stitch these together. We'll pick those and we'll hit stitch together. And there is our complete bottom. We'll come here and we'll pick this shared edge. We can come all the way to the top, double click. That just gets the edges in between, and we'll hit stitch together. And we want these to fit in the one-to-one. So this is the space that gets output. And this allows you to go between different applications and different software packages if you just have your UV all in one space. And we'll come and scale. And we just want to make sure that they're fitting in the UV. Now when we're painting, we don't want any overlap, right? So we'll set that there. There is our UV map laid out. We use just a quick review. We cut edges. We use the stitch and sew. We use the unfold just on our cylinders. And several times we used the flip UV before we did our sew and stitch. Final step is to get this out. If you were painting in Maya, you could just go ahead and use your paint effects at this point. But probably more common is to export this to a third-party paint package. And the one thing to keep in mind is that the object has to, the model has to be selected in object mode. So a lot of times we're working with UVs, right, which technically we're in component mode, right? And it wouldn't export. If I come, this little camera is the export, or you could come to image, UV snapshot. So I said export, I should say UV snapshot, which is essentially exporting the UV so that you could open it in a third-party application. So if I say UV snapshot, that'll open, but if I try to say OK, you can see that I have an error down here because this needs to be selected as an object. Other thing to consider, here's your browse. So this is where you will be saving it to. And you probably want to save it in your source images folder because that's where your texture should be saved to. Size is always an interesting question. It's just a matter of how close your model and texture will be to the camera. I would just say something in the 2000 range for this initial course would be okay. But hit browse and you can save it to the source images folder. And then make sure that it's a JPEG. By default, I don't think Photoshop will open a Maya IFF file. So we're saving it as a JPEG, size 2000, and then we have our browse there. And you hit OK, and you can see because it was in object mode, that's saved out. Yeah, that's it. Questions in the tech forum.